And what kind of investigation you did into the Billy Meier case?
Well, at first it was just to try to check the veracity of the case itself, to find out what the evidence was behind it that supported it, and I did that for several years. And then I learned about the Talmud of Jmmanuel document that was associated with the case, and then I spent most of the rest of my time since then looking into the genuineness of this ancient document that was discovered in 1963.
What conclusions you came to?
Well, after many years' research, I've just found hundreds of reasons, hundreds of them, that indicate the Talmud of Jmmanuel was the source of the Gospel of Matthew, in the New Testament Gospel of Matthew, and that it was no hoax based upon the Gospel of Matthew. There's just too many things it explains, too many uncertainties that the scholars, New Testament scholars, have had over the centuries and years that are explained by this document that in a totally creative way that the scholars themselves would never be able to accept, because there's so many problems they would have with the Talmud of Jmmanuel. But yet for someone with an open mind who was outside of the establishment, they can see the reality of it, I would hope. The scholars have many reasons why they can't look into this document. Like, for one, it's heretical in quite a few different ways, not just one or two ways. And, well, I came to the conclusion that the case could be no hoax, based mainly upon the first-hand investigations of the primary investigators that were investigating the case when it was only 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. This was mainly Wendell Stevens and his associates, plus Gary Kinder, who did thorough investigations in 1983. The other investigation started in about 1977, and his case became noted to the public in 1975. And so I looked into it as much depth as I could, even went to Switzerland in 1985 to check out a few of the secondary witnesses that I could. It all checked out, plus the reasons why certain debunkers are totally against the case. It all made sense that it was very real. And then it was back in 1984 that I learned about a document that came out of this case called the Talmud of Jmmanuel that purports to be the true teachings of Jesus, except his name was Emmanuel then, until Paul got it converted to Jesus through Paul's own desires to call him Yeshua. And so learning about this document then started to occupy my time, and I turned myself into a New Testament scholar as best I could to look into the genuineness of it and find out that the Gospel of Matthew is closely related to the Talmud of Jmmanuel. And one follows along the other closely enough so that you know that either the Talmud of Jmmanuel was the source of the Gospel of Matthew, or that it's a 20th century hoax based upon the Gospel of Matthew. So I've been spending my 14 or so years since 1983 examining those two possibilities, and I can only conclude that there are several hundred reasons that indicate the Talmud of Jmmanuel was genuine, the source of the Gospel of Matthew, and it was no hoax.
What is the most convincing reason?
Well, it's mostly the accumulation of evidence of each of these 300 reasons or 320 reasons by itself may not be totally convincing, but you put them all together and they're overwhelmingly convincing. These range from very minor things that scholars have picked on with the Gospel of Matthew, that you read through the Talmud of Jmmanuel and you find that the mistake isn't there. The Talmud of Jmmanuel reads something somewhat different there that was heretical. The compiler, the writer of the Gospel of Matthew, had to alter it to make it compatible with his own beliefs and the beliefs of the early Christian church. And so in so doing, he made some little mistake here and there that some scholars have picked up and written about in the literature. And then you can find that the Talmud of Jmmanuel just doesn't suffer from that error, and this happens over and over again with a lot of minor things. But then there's the major things that explains how Jesus, whom I call Emmanuel, how he could have had appearances after the crucifixion. Well, the biggest heresy, I guess, within the Talmud of Jmmanuel was that he survived the crucifixion. Of course, this is in accordance with a lot of legends that say he traveled around Anatolia or the Turkish area and eventually farther east and on to the India, Kashmir region, where he lived a long life and finally did die and was buried in a tomb in Srinagar, Kashmir in the early 2nd century. So we have these major things that the Talmud of Jmmanuel explains too, how those legends got going, how the disciples insisted that they had seen the risen Jesus, the risen Emmanuel, in the days following the crucifixion, several different appearances, and why these appearances in the different Gospels are all slightly contradictory to each other. This was a very sensitive item. Each one had to be edited by its Gospel author to be sanctionable, and through that editing they all differed from each other in one way or another. So the scholars have tended to discount the post-crucifixion appearances of Jesus totally. Most of the modern scholars do for that reason, although in so doing they're just saying that, well, where there's a lot of smoke we don't think there was any fire, which is not a very good reasoning to use very often. That's just one example of one major thing. There's too many others. One major heresy, well, one series of heresies is that the teachings of Emmanuel, I would say, were altered and distorted because they were unacceptable about 85% of the time. And this is because he taught about spirituality, taught about the existence of the human spirit, its evolution over lifetime after lifetime, which meant he taught about reincarnation. He taught about eventually perfecting yourself in spirit zillions of lifetimes into the future, becoming almost one with a true God, which he calls creation in the Talmud of Jmmanuel. All that had to be edited out, leaving the writer of the Gospel of Matthew to substitute all kinds of stuff in its place, in particular talking about the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God, wherever the Talmud of Jmmanuel would talk about the realm of the spirit, the realm of the human spirit. That alteration was pretty successful for him. There weren't too many complaints about that, but now and then it would lead him into trouble. Something didn't fit the text right, and he would go on with the text and then find that there's a contradiction, and the contradiction would be picked up. One of the contradictions that comes to my mind is early in Matthew, Jesus is quoted as saying that you shouldn't swear. You just should say yes, yes, or no, no. Just don't swear by anything. Then about 18 verses later in the Gospel of Matthew, he says, if you're going to swear, don't swear by the gold in the temple, but it's the temple that makes the gold sacred. And if you're going to swear by God, it's because God is the God of everything. In other words, he contradicts this earlier spot, and you can compare this with the Talmud of Jmmanuel and find that the Talmud of Jmmanuel was consistent throughout. This is what there's hundreds of examples of in the Talmud of Jmmanuel, indicating that Emmanuel was a logical teacher. He had to teach spirituality in as logical way as he could. And this probably wasn't too easy to do. But when it all had to be altered to fit the conceptions of the early church, all kinds of distortions and inaccuracies crept in that made it illogical here and there. And it's this kind of illogic that the scholars have picked up over and over again in the Gospel of Matthew. So
did you look into the physical information in the Billy Meier contact notes, and did you find anything of interest or of possible verification?
well, as an atmospheric scientist, I was interested in various aspects of those notes, or as a person interested in physics in general. And I must admit there are a lot of places in the contact reports of things that Billy Meier were told mainly by his contactor, who was called Semyasi, things that we don't think are right by present-day knowledge, 20th century knowledge of physics or history or whatever. And it's hard to say whether this is due to our lack of knowledge. The 20th century knowledge is just not going to be at all permanent in comparison with what we know 20 centuries from now, for example, or whether it's actually that maybe Billy Meier wasn't told the truth always by his contactor. And it does seem like she may have fed in disinformation now and then, just purposely, to make sure that the Billy Meier case wouldn't become so prominent, because after all, he was given at least 500 opportunities to take photographs in 1975 through 78 or so on 18 or 19 different occasions, ending up with 500 or 600 photographs of their UFOs or beam ships. They gave him so much material that way that he could, you might think, easily blow open the UFO cover-up. And I don't think any extraterrestrial group at that time or even now is quite ready for that. I mean, they know the human race isn't quite prepared enough for that. So by feeding in disinformation here and there to what they told Billy, that Billy wouldn't recognize as being disinformation because he knew how much truth they had told him and other things. They'd shown him a lot. They could then make his contact reports be rather silly sounding in places to scientists of particular branches of science, like astronomy and so on. And that way, if the scientists would immediately dismiss his case because of what they read in the contact report and say, oh, Billy Meier must have made this up himself because it doesn't make sense, although this does mean that these scientists are assuming that extraterrestrials would always tell the truth. That's not a very good assumption. But this nevertheless seems to be the assumption they tend to make, and so it made Billy Meier very debunkable in terms of scientists' eyes, just because there are some of these statements in his contact reports that sound like they probably can't be true. So that doesn't mean there isn't a lot of other things in interest in his contact reports, and it's just up to anyone who gets interested in it to try to feed out, to separate the wheat from the chaff and figure out for themselves which part of it is true and which may not be. Because I spent quite some time doing this too.
What kind of agenda the Pleiadians might have in feeding this information into the case?
Well, like I say, they want to make sure that Billy Meier is not treated his information so truly that his case and all his photographs are suddenly believed, first by ufologists and then by the news media and then by scientists and by everyone else, such that it would blow the UFO cover up, or it might turn Billy Meier into the guru of a new religion too, if everyone suddenly started realizing that everything he was told was gospel truth, and all they had to do was turn to Billy Meier to hear what the gospel truth is. They would perhaps stop thinking for themselves like people do within a religion, like just listening to your pastor and not interpreting the Bible or looking into the source of it yourself. And there's reason to believe that the ETs really don't have that in mind. They might have operated that way thousands of years ago and tended to generate new religions, but I think they realize we're past that point now, that science and astronomy has gotten us far enough along that we know where extraterrestrials could come from now. I mean, we know that there are planets around other stars, and probably livable planets, and that they could have had billions of years, actually, several billions of years head start over us, and hundreds of millions of years a head start of us in evolution for the aliens involved, so that they could have gotten from there to here. They could be the first ones to discover us before we discover them. And all this is the implications of what the contact notes might lead you to believe if you were to believe them all were true. What was the rest of your question now? Well, in terms of the Talmud of Jmmanuel, like I say, there's all this indirect evidence that indicates it's true.
Physical information, how we spoke about the Talmud.
Well, certainly the Meier case photographs, they haven't been shown false in any way, although there's a book by Cal Korff that alleges to do this, and it fails miserably. How do I what on the book?
How do you comment on the Cal Korff book?
Well, I've gone over various sections of that book and find it really is just filled with distortions, actual falsifications here and there, a lot of false claims, a lot of irrelevant information too, just all piled in on top of each other. I did go over one section carefully of just 8 pages and found about 35 distortions in these various categories just in those 8 pages. And a colleague of mine has done the same with the rest of his book, and it's just that way. He's I don't know if he can believe himself in this or whether he's just debunking it because that's his agenda. But a key example is he has in his book certain of the photographs from the Meier case that have parallel scratch-like lines coming across somewhat above the beam ship in the photograph. And he calls these suspension lines, but these suspension lines come across at a quasi-horizontal angle. They're not horizontal, they're not vertical, they're at an angle like this. There's sometimes 2 or 3 of them, just where there's only one beam ship involved. And the lines show no point where they would take a jog where a suspending line would be hanging down from it, holding up the weight of a model UFO. That doesn't happen. You don't see any of these lines that have a slight kink there. They just all go straight across, and some of them are curved upwards even above the beam ship in the photo. We don't know exactly how he got those lines in his photographs, but he pretends that they're suspension lines, points arrows to them in his book, and tries to make the reader believe that these were part of a hoax when they're nothing of the sort, as anyone can see who actually reads that part of his book carefully. So I don't really want to waste much more time on this book of Cal Korff's. It just isn't worth discussing. Tough information. There's the metal samples, you know, that were gone over that were just miraculous in their appearance of how the various different elements within a given.
What is your impression of the Billy Meier case? To what conclusion you came after your own investigation into it?
Well, at one point I tried to look into the odds that it could be a hoax. What are the odds that someone could go off into the Swiss countryside, 15 or 20 miles away from his little town on his motorbike, his moped, and have with him enough equipment and a camera and a tripod, and somehow suspend a large model here and there in front of a tree without there being any support coming out from the tree that holds it up, so you wouldn't know quite how he could do it. How could he get all this equipment out there and back without leaving traces of it? Or balloons, helium-filled balloons that would hold these things up. How could that be done without citizenry of the countryside noticing the balloons and immediately knowing that he would be a hoaxer? But that never came about. And time after time he would go out and do this, and these large-scale models were never found. But you might calculate how he could have gotten away with each step of this over and over again to obtain his photos. And I ended up with like 1 chance in 10 to the 24th or so on my best estimate of it. That's like 1 chance in million, I guess it is. Much smaller than the chance of winning a lottery. But it all depends upon your belief system, whether you think such a thing is possible. If you don't think any one person could be given a contact like Billy Meier was, a series of contacts, then you assume at the outset it must be a hoax, or you don't want it to be true, so you assume it must be a hoax, and then you would never investigate the fundamental evidence in the first place that shows it can't possibly be a hoax.
But to give a personal summary conclusion, what is your personal opinion on the Billy Meier case?
Well, personally, I believe it's no hoax, that it's real, it's very genuine. He's been contacted. He apparently still is being contacted sporadically, and that very useful teachings on spirituality have been given to him. These are teachings that agree with the spirituality that was apparently taught by the man we know as Jesus, who was really named Emmanuel at birth, and that this may be the most important part of his contacts. These documents that spell out what Christianity, the track it should have taken in place of where it did go, and what the original teachings really were.
Thank you very much.